There is a woman you already know, someone you talk to, someone whose name appears in your phone more than most. And the line between what you have and what you want is thinner than you have been telling yourself. You have probably told yourself the safer story, that this is just friendship, that you're not sure how you feel, or that you're sure but the timing isn't right, or that bringing anything into the open would risk something you're not willing to lose. And so you stay in the dynamic you're in, comfortable enough to continue, uncomfortable enough to watch this video at all. Here is what most men in this position don't realize. The dynamic you're in is not neutral. It is not a holding pattern waiting for the right moment. It is sending her a signal right now, a clear, consistent signal, and she is receiving it. The question is not whether she is reading you. She is. The question is what she is reading. Is what you already have with her closer to attraction than you realize? And are you the only one in the dynamic who doesn't know it yet? By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how attraction builds inside a friendship, what has been working against you, what you can shift, and how to do it without losing the one thing you're most afraid to lose. The friend zone is not something she put you in. It is something that formed around a particular version of how you show up, and versions can change. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because most men who feel stuck in a friendship dynamic carry a quiet, heavy assumption that some decision was made about them, that she looked at them at some point and filed them under a particular category, and that the filing is permanent. That is not how this works. Women do not consciously assign roles. What happens is far more organic and therefore far more movable than that. What she has been responding to is a cumulative impression. Every conversation, every interaction, every way you have shown up in her life over time has contributed to a picture she carries of who you are in relation to her. That picture is not a verdict, it is a read. And reads update when new information arrives. The friend zone, understood correctly, is simply the natural outcome of a set of consistent behavioral signals. Signals that communicated safety, availability, and zero romantic ambiguity. Not bad signals, just signals that built one kind of relationship rather than another. That is the most important reframe you can take from this entire video. She didn't decide you weren't an option. The version of you she has experienced most consistently hasn't yet given her reason to think of you as one. That distinction matters enormously because what you built is not an obstacle. It is a foundation, one that, handled correctly, becomes an advantage no stranger walking into her life can match. But before you can change the signal you're sending, you need to understand exactly what signal you've been sending and why it made complete sense to her nervous system even as it moved you further from what you wanted. You have probably been doing everything right by the standards of being a good friend, and that is precisely the problem. Think back to how you have operated in this friendship. You respond when she reaches out, usually quickly because you want to be there for her. You listen when she needs to talk, fully, without making it about yourself. You never push her into uncomfortable territory. You manage your own feelings carefully because the last thing you want is to make things weird. Each of these behaviors individually is kind. Together, they form a pattern that communicates something specific, consistently, without a word being said. What that pattern communicates is this: I am safe. I am always here. There is nothing uncertain about me. Psychologists describe this as behavioral predictability, the quality of being so consistent in a relationship that the other person's nervous system never has to engage with you in a heightened state. That phrase matters, a heightened state. Not anxiety, not drama, just the mild, involuntary alertness that happens when someone is slightly uncertain what comes next. That alertness is not discomfort. It is the substrate of attraction. By being completely predictable, completely available, and completely free of any ambiguity about your intentions, you have created a relationship in which she feels entirely comfortable. And comfort and attraction, while related, are not the same thing. Comfort is what she feels with her closest friends. Attraction carries a slight edge, a slight question mark, something that makes her pay attention slightly differently. You might be thinking, but I don't want to create discomfort. I don't want to make her anxious or unsure of where she stands. And that is a completely understandable instinct. But there is a significant difference between productive uncertainty, the kind that makes someone lean in, and the kind that creates distress. What we are talking about here is not removing her sense of safety. It is adding something to the dynamic she hasn't had reason to feel yet. One more thing before we move forward, because this is important and most explanations skip it. The patterns we are describing are not character flaws. They are what happens when a man genuinely cares about a woman and manages that care by putting her comfort above everything else, including his own authentic expression. You are being generous. The shift ahead is not about becoming someone different, it is about letting more of yourself through. Knowing the pattern is half of it. The other half is understanding what she is actually waiting to feel. Because attraction in a woman doesn't switch on through logic. It arrives through something she experiences, not something she decides. She is not waiting for a confession. She is not waiting for the perfect moment. She is waiting, often without knowing she is waiting, to feel something shift. Female attraction does not operate the way we tend to imagine from the outside. It is not a conclusion she reaches after evaluating the available information. It is a feeling that develops through accumulated experience of a particular quality, and that quality is almost impossible to manufacture because it has to be felt, not observed. What she is waiting for, neurologically speaking, is what researchers describe as mild affective arousal, a state of mild alertness, of engaged attention, of slight uncertainty that draws the mind back to think about someone after the interaction is over. This is not excitement in the performative sense. It is subtler than that. It is the specific feeling of replaying a moment and not being entirely sure what it meant. You have probably experienced a version of this yourself. A conversation that seemed ordinary while it was happening, that you found yourself thinking about later without a clear reason. What made it linger was not what was said. It was something in the texture of the interaction, something slightly unresolved that your mind kept returning to in order to complete. That quality is what you have not yet introduced into your dynamic with her. Not because you are incapable of it, but because you have been so focused on making things comfortable, on keeping things clear, on never adding any complication, that you have inadvertently created a dynamic with no edges. Nothing for her attention to catch on. Nothing that prompts her to think about you after you've gone. Of course, context matters enormously here. This is not an invitation to become unpredictable in ways that feel unstable or confusing. What we are describing is a very specific and very delicate shift, not in who you are, but in how much of yourself you bring into the space between you. The man who shows up the same way every time, who is always warm and always available and always easy, he disappears into the background of her life. Not because he is invalued, but because there is nothing asking her to look more closely. Remember what I said at the very beginning of this video? That the dynamic you're in is already sending her a signal. And the question is what that signal says. We are getting close to what needs to change in that signal. But first, I want to show you the specific shift that changes everything. One that has nothing to do with playing hard to get and everything to do with having a genuine life. You don't become more attractive to her by doing more. You become more attractive by becoming slightly less predictable. Not as a strategy, but as a consequence of actually having a life that doesn't arrange itself around her. This is the shift most advice gets wrong because it frames it as technique. Pull back, wait longer to respond, say less. And when it is presented as technique, she feels it immediately. Women are extraordinarily sensitive to inauthenticity in the men they are close to. She has spent enough time with you to know your rhythms. If you suddenly start performing a version of unavailability, it will not read as attractive. It will read as odd or distant or like something is wrong. What actually works is genuine selective presence, the natural consequence of being a man who has a full life and brings himself to interactions rather than arranging himself around the other person. Here is what this looks like in practice. When she messages you, you respond when you have something real to say, rather than immediately because you are waiting. Not because you are engineering a delay, but because you are genuinely engaged in something else and you answer when you come up for air. When plans are being made, you have genuine preferences about how you spend your time, and you express them simply, without over-apologizing. When she tells you about her day, you listen, but you also share your own, with real texture, rather than making the conversation entirely about her. None of this requires performance. What it requires is that you stop editing yourself down to what you think she finds convenient. The version of you that has an opinion, that has momentum, that doesn't instantly rearrange itself around her needs, that version of you is not less considerate. He is simply more present as himself. And presence, real presence, is what she has been missing from the dynamic. The mistake that typically happens at this stage is overcompensating, going from always available to suddenly distant in a way that reads as cold. That is not the goal, and it will not produce the result. The shift is not away from warmth. It is toward a warmth that has some dimension to it, some texture, some evidence of a man who exists independently of her approval. Presence is the foundation, but there is a second shift, one that happens in how you see her and how you let her know you see her. And this one, done correctly, is what actually begins to move her. She doesn't need you to tell her how you feel. She needs to feel something in how you are with her that she can't quite explain to herself, something that makes her replay the conversation later. There is a particular quality of attention that is distinct from friendship and distinct from declaration, and it lives in a narrow band between the two. Learning to operate in that band is what separates the men who successfully shift a dynamic from the men who either say nothing and wait indefinitely or say everything at once and change the atmosphere entirely. Friendly attention is broad. It is warm toward everything, present to the general experience of the interaction. Romantic attention is specific. It notices particular things, a specific thing she said, the way she laughed at something unexpected, the moment when she became suddenly serious. And it reflects that noticing back in a way that tells her she was seen more closely than usual. Here is what this looks like in a real conversation. She says something that reveals a layer of herself she doesn't usually show. Not dramatically, just a small, honest moment. And instead of letting it pass the way a friend would, you pause on it. You say something simple and direct. That's actually one of the things I find most interesting about the way you think. Not a compliment about her appearance, not a generic, "you're great." A specific observation that could only be made by someone who has been paying close attention. Or you hold eye contact for one beat longer than the conversation strictly requires, not staring, not performing, just not looking away at the moment when most people break contact. She will notice. She won't know why she noticed, but the moment will come back to her later. You might be thinking, isn't this just flattery with extra steps? No. Flattery is broad and untethered. What we're describing is the expression of genuine attention that you already feel but have been withholding because expressing it felt like crossing the line. The line doesn't have to be crossed all at once. It can be approached gradually through moments that register as different without triggering alarm. One instance of this lands softly and does very little. A pattern of it over multiple interactions, building steadily, begins to change what she feels when she knows she's about to see you. That anticipation is not nothing. That anticipation is the beginning of something. Now, and I want to address this directly because it is the fear underneath every other question in this conversation. What about the friendship? What is the actual risk, and is it as large as you think it is? The friendship is not most at risk when you say something. It is most at risk in the long, quiet months when you say nothing, and everything slowly becomes harder to navigate. This is the part that most men have not been told clearly, and I want to be honest with you about it because it matters. When you carry unexpressed feelings in a friendship for an extended period, something happens to the dynamic that has nothing to do with what you say or don't say. Your behavior becomes slightly inconsistent. You are warm, then slightly pull back, then warm again. Not because you're trying to signal anything, but because you are managing something internal that is taking real effort to manage. She picks this up. She doesn't have a name for it, but she starts to feel underneath the surface of the friendship a kind of ambient tension, something slightly unresolved that neither of you is naming. That unresolved quality is what actually damages friendships, not the expression of interest, the long silent accumulation of something that isn't being addressed. Now, this doesn't mean the solution is a sudden full declaration at an emotionally loaded moment. That approach carries real risk, not because of what you say, but because of the timing and weight of how it arrives. What we are describing throughout this video, the gradual shift in presence, the specific quality of attention, is a way of introducing your real self into the dynamic incrementally, in a way that gives her time to respond and give you real information about where she is. If she responds to the shift, you will know. Not because she announces anything, but because her behavior will begin to mirror yours. She will start to initiate more. She will find reasons for the two of you to be in the same place. She will pay attention to you in a slightly different way than she did before. If she doesn't respond to the shift, you will also know, and you will have done nothing dramatic enough to make the friendship impossible to return to. That is the reason this approach is not just effective. It is genuinely the safest way to navigate this. Not safer than silence in the sense of avoiding all risk, but safer in the sense of actually giving the friendship a chance to become what it might be, rather than preserving a version of it that is already asking more of you than it is giving back. And that brings us to the one factor that determines everything. The one that has nothing to do with tactics, nothing to do with timing, and everything to do with something you may not have thought to look at. She will not be able to tell you what she is picking up on, but she will pick up on it. Women read authenticity through texture, not through what is said, but through whether everything about how someone shows up is consistent with itself. This is the factor that no behavioral shift, no carefully timed response, no specific phrasing can compensate for if it is absent. And it is the factor that makes everything else in this video either work or fall flat. She has spent real time with you. She knows your rhythms, your patterns, the particular way you move through conversation. That familiarity is an asset. But it is also a very sensitive instrument. If what you begin to do feels performed, if the shift in your presence feels like something you decided to try rather than something that is genuinely coming from you, she will feel the dissonance before she can name it. It will produce a slight, vague discomfort. the kind that makes someone take a small step back without quite knowing why. The only thing that makes the behavioral shifts in this video land the way they need to land is if they are grounded in honesty. Specifically, your honesty with yourself about what you actually feel. Not honesty with her, not yet, not as a declaration. Honesty inside yourself about the fact that what you want from this relationship is different from what you have been performing. That internal clarity produces an external coherence she can feel. Think about what it looks like when a man is fully congruent, when what he feels, what he thinks, and how he shows up are all pointing in the same direction. There is an ease to it, a lack of friction. Nothing about him is working against itself. She may not be able to articulate why he feels different from other men in her life, but she will feel it. And that feeling is the foundation of everything we have been talking about. The question that opened this video was whether what you already have with her is closer to attraction than you realize, and whether you are the only one in the dynamic who doesn't know it. The answer, after everything we've covered, is this: she already senses something. Whether she has named it, even to herself, is a different question. But the texture of what she picks up from you is already forming a picture. What you do next determines what that picture becomes. So let's bring this together quietly before I let you go. Everything we've covered in this video points to one central truth. The transition from friendship to attraction is not a leap. It is a gradual recalibration of signal. The friend zone formed because a particular version of you showed up consistently. A different version of you, not a performance, not a strategy, but a more complete version of yourself, will produce a different response. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily and in a way that gives her something real to respond to. The overarching principle is this: she cannot be attracted to a version of you she has never been allowed to see. The work here is not in changing who you are. It is in stopping the editing process that has kept the most interesting parts of you out of this particular relationship. You now have something you didn't have before you pressed play. You have a framework for understanding what has been happening and what can shift. You don't need to overanalyze every interaction or manufacture moments. You need to show up more fully, more honestly, more completely, and trust that the woman you already know well enough to care about this much will recognize what she feels when she feels it. Is there a woman in your life right now where you recognize something in this video, a dynamic that suddenly looks different after watching this? Tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone. If this gave you something worth thinking about, subscribe, because this channel is built specifically for men who want to understand female psychology at a level that actually changes how they navigate their real lives, not just their ideas about it. In the next video, I'm going to show you the exact signals she sends when she has already crossed from friendship into attraction, and why almost every man reads those signals as nothing more than her being friendly. If you have a woman like that in your life, you need to watch that video before your next conversation with her.